Welcome back, everybody. This is Weirdly Artistic episode. Doesn't matter.
Doesn't matter. Does not matter.
But I'm Jose.
I'm Nick.
And we are Weirdly Artistic. And we want to bring you some information.
Just some help to get you thinking about something.
Get that mind cranking.
Yeah, the cogs are flowing. We're a well-oiled machine here, as far as you know.
But today we wanted to talk about, this is something that we've touched on before, but knowing your camera. So we've touched on it as a topic, but I think today we wanted to fully delve deep into it and really break it all down to you on what you should be focusing on when knowing your camera. And even before you buy a camera, like what are you looking for?
What do you need?
Exactly.
Like, what are your shoots? What are you aiming for? Are you niching yourself?
Mm-hmm.
I think, like, if you're niching yourself, that really affects what you need. Mm-hmm. Do you need versatility? Do you need just photography? Do you need just video?
And
what is it?
Something that we recently started doing is niching down a little more. It's great to be a jack of all trades, but you should, at least at the beginning, focus on one thing.
Yeah. Or like do like a 70-30, you know? Mm-hmm. It's okay to take on other gigs,
but you should definitely try to not spread yourself too thin, I think is the best way to put it.
Yeah, trust us.
Don't spread yourself too thin. When you spread yourself too thin, stuff can definitely get a little more difficult.
Well, you lose quality and your name's on the line.
Exactly. But we want to talk about knowing your camera, and the first thing
everyone should know.
I think that actually the first three things that everyone should generally know are ISO, aperture, and your shutter speed.
Yeah.
Right?
They all tie together.
They're all tied together, and you should probably figure out what you're going to be shooting for the most part.
Yeah. If you're shooting action and or high action things, you need a specific
shutter speed.
If you're doing real estate or if you're doing interviews, you need the exact opposite.
Mm-hmm.
So that kind of helps you decide what you're looking for.
Let's jump right into it. Shutter speed.
Shutter speed.
Right. So shutter speed does with the speed of
how quickly
movements,
the shutter.
Right, exactly. How fast the shutter moves. It can go from...
It depends on your camera.
It does.
But most cameras nowadays that you're going to get will have a 30-second open time to like a 1/2500.
Right. And
what does that mean?
1/2500 is 1/2500th of a second.
Fast.
Right. So it's very really fast. You're talking 30 seconds to a fraction of a second. Right.
And like imagine your shutter as like opening and closing a door.
Mm-hmm.
Like it's, if you're at 1/2500, I don't even think I can clap my hands that fast. Yeah. But like that's what you're clapping at. If you're doing long exposure, you're going to leave it open and you're basically allowing that light to come in for 30 seconds. Like
the longer your shutter speed is, the more light it is allowing through.
Yeah.
So obviously if you're doing high movement stuff, sports, cars, anything that's going to be moving at a
really high speed,
you want to shrink your shutter speed.
Well,
right?
That's where a caveat comes in. If you want everything in focus, you should be shooting at a 1/500 or a 1/800, right?
Mm-hmm.
But if you want to get artistic with it, like you're shooting a car and you're hanging out of the side of another moving vehicle,
and you want blur behind the car,
that's where the long exposure creativeness comes in. So you would shoot at, let's say, a 1/8 or maybe a 1/2, allowing your shutter to capture more light for the things that are moving. But if you can keep your camera steady and hold on that car, your car's going to be in focus and the rest will be blurred.
Exactly. So generally the way this works is your car that you're going to be using as your subject is going to be moving at a similar or the same speed as you are. So that should stay in focus. Everything else behind it, trees, other cars, everything else is going to have a bit of a blur because the light that's coming in isn't staying right
in the same place.
Exactly.
Besides the one subject that you have.
So your car stays in focus. Everything else gets blurred, and it's a creative choice to blur everything out and get just your car in
focus.
In focus.
Yeah. And we'll throw up an example. We have a great example.
So, I mean, the same thing ties with sports. Let's say football. Football is very popular in the U.S.
Yep.
If you're shooting sports, we know a couple people that shoot
For the
the Seahawks even.
Yeah.
They're going to be shooting at, I would say, like, what, a 1
over 500?
Yeah, exactly.
Minimum.
To get that crisp movement as stuff is happening. If you've shot out like 1 over 100, 1 over 250, it can still be blurry.
You'll see some motion blur.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
And that might be a creative choice. And that's up to you when you learn these things. But
and just like with everything is practice. Because even if you're shooting at 1 over 500, you're not going to get the crisp shot right off the bat on your first try.
no.
You could.
From everyone we've talked to that does sports or shoots action all the time, they shoot 1,000 photos and 20 of them are what they're going to post and or use.
Exactly.
Like, even the pros.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, those guys that have been doing it for 20 years, you know, that percentage might be higher. But
I mean, obviously, the better you get with a camera, the more accuracy,
more fluent
the better you'll be, regardless of that.
I think that's with every skill that you hop into.
So that's generally shutter speed.
What does shutter do to your light?
What do you mean?
So let's say that I have my shutter open for 30 seconds. What does that do to the light coming in? It's going to be really high, right?
Yeah.
But if I shoot at 1 over 25 or 1 over 2500,
it's going to be very low light.
Really low light,
very
right?
low light, yeah.
So that's something to think about. And that's where we hop into the next tools. And I think that Aperture is next to hop into. If you have a very short time that your shutter speed's open, it's going to be very dark. If you have a very long time that it's open, it's going to be very bright. So you need to counter with your aperture, which brings in the creative aspect, right?
Right. So aperture itself is how open your lens is.
Yeah.
Right.
How much light the lens is letting into the sensor.
Yeah. So let's say your aperture is this, right? The lower the number, the wider it's going to be. The higher the number, the smaller it's going to be.
Yeah.
So obviously the lower the number, similar with shutter speed, but just kind of backwards.
It's opposite.
Exactly. So the lower the aperture and more open it is, the more light that's going to come in.
Yeah.
And then vice versa. The higher the aperture, the more closed the aperture will be and the less light that it'll allow in.
And if you're on a set, you're going to hear, let's open it up or let's close it. And that's where they're talking about is, you know, it's like, let's go to a 2.7. I want to open it up a little bit. It means you're literally opening the aperture. You are letting the lens. It's like if you were to look at the scene and like pull your eyelids apart.
Yeah, you're
like,
opening your eyes, right? You're allowing more light in.
The lens is your light and the shutter speed is your brain.
Yeah.
That's the way to think about it.
So it's really, really simple. With that, the more open your aperture is, the less focal range, I would say.
Yeah,
right?
It gets tighter.
The tighter the focal range is, so less is going to be in focus and more is going to be blurred out.
Yeah.
Versus when you close your aperture at a higher number, more of what's in frame is going to be in focus. If you're doing a landscape and you want everything in focus, you're going to close your shutter and
open or close.
Close the shutter. Raise the number of the shutter, basically.
Your aperture. Raise the number of your aperture, yeah.
Raise the number of the aperture and close it to get more of what's in frame.
Full range, yeah.
Get a full range of everything being in focus. So that's kind of how you help counteract when you have a high shutter
if you're
high
shooting
shutter
at a high
speed
shutter, you
or
might
a low
need
shutter.
to adjust with your aperture. But it's also very dependent on what you're shooting. And so there are different scenarios where you'll come across where it's like, I have a detailed photo that I need to get, and I need to be at a 1.8 or a 2.2 aperture. I don't have any other option, right? So then you're going to adjust those settings based off of your aperture. So there are scenarios where it's like, if you're shooting action or you're shooting high-speed things, start with your shutter. But if you're shooting detailed things or close-up things or where you really need to focus on what the blur amount is, start with your aperture.
Start with your aperture.
Yeah. I said that backwards, but yeah.
With that, your aperture and your shutter speed, they both tie in with light, which is ISO specifically, right? So with ISO, it really is how much light you have available to you.
Yeah.
the more light that is naturally there, or whether you're using a fill or you're using just the light itself, the lower number ISO you'll need for the more light that is available. If you're shooting in very low light, you're going to want to raise your ISO, right? So it just allows more light in.
Yeah, it's like what it's telling your sensor, this is how bright the scene is, essentially. And like, if let's just say your shutter speed is at a 1/250 and your ISO or your aperture is at a 3.2, you're probably going to be shooting at a 400 to 800 ISO, depending on your camera. It just depends, and that's something you're going to have to learn on your own.
And then depending on the environment too, how much light is already naturally
supplied.
there.
Yeah. Or are you bringing light?
Yeah.
And that's what you can decide. And bringing light is super, super important if you want to hit your native ISO. Because you can always adjust, right?
Right.
You can always be like, oh, I need to be at 100 ISO and I need to be at a 2.2 and then I need, a 1/50. The problem with that is grain. You could run into grain because your camera essentially is making up data.
Yeah. So the higher the ISO, a lot of the times you're going to start getting more grain, more noise,
and lower
just
as well,
losing detail. And then same with the lower you go, the farther away lower and higher that you go from your native ISO, the more you're going to lose in your detail and your highlights and shadows.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, and so you got to tie all three together.
And that is the symbiotic relationship.
Between
if you're focusing on a sports shoot or a car shoot, you're going to be focusing on your shutter speed, and then you're adjusting your ISO and your aperture to help with that.
And your skill based, as you get better, will allow you to say, okay, I'm at a 1/500 with my shutter and I want to shoot a 2.8 for sports. If you're first starting, don't do that, because you are putting yourself in a really, really tight spot of a really short focal length of grabbing focus. And that can really hinder you.
Yeah.
So it's, set your shutter speed and then find how quickly you can grab focus. And some of these new cameras, that you can grab focus with is insane. It's so fast. But for us, we've always trained manual. And it's so that if those tools don't work,
if your autofocus goes out of whack or
if it's just not working, or like if you are shooting sports where there's 22 people on the field, it might grab focus of someone else.
Yeah.
So you really want to learn those skills before you start breaking them.
And just like I said, it's really just about practicing. Know what you're
just know how they correlate.
Know what you're adjusting, and just practice. Practice is going to make perfect.
Yeah.
And that's how you're going to get the most experience and become the best at what you're trying to do.
Yeah. And I think shutter speed and ISO strictly are based off of the subject that you're shooting. Or the topic, whatever you want to say. And your ISO basically follows in suit. And then when you get advanced enough, you can say, I don't want to leave 800 ISO. But then that includes external gear, where you need to bring in lights. You need to bring in, fills and things that
diffusers, fills, whatever.
Dependent on your location. And that will come with time. It just... if you say, I never want to leave a 400 to 800 ISO, good luck. It's just bring the gear.
Yeah.
You have to be ready. It's not, I don't think that you can sit in a native ISO on every single shoot without having external gear.
Yeah. I think that's pretty accurate. You're always going to run into something where you have to adjust. Yeah. You have to adapt. And I think
Murphy's Law is the most applicable law to filmmaking. If it can happen, it will.
Or anything that can happen will happen, and you should just be prepared. And knowing these three aspects of photography and video are going to help you a lot.
It'll make you such a strong shooter. It'll give you the understanding that there are some rules that you should follow. And I've always said, learn them so you can break them. But there's going to be times where you want to push your limits. And with the Lambo shoot, where I was like, hey, I'm going to mess with some long exposure and see what happens. And did the twisty thing. I took the shutter and I put it really low. I put it at I think it was 1/5 or 1/5.
Or something like that. Yeah.
And I just held it and then twisted really quick. And I made this crazy blur effect. So you can start to mess with stuff, but understand what they do first before really experimenting. Get good at the basics.
Get good at the basics to learn how to break the rules, basically.
Yeah. I've told you that from the beginning. Is
learn the rules so you can break them.
And my professors told me that in school too. Learn them so you can break them. And I think it's just a good rule to be there for. Like, if you have a good understanding with cameras before you've learned all this stuff, good for you. I think that's awesome.
And then with that, along with knowing your cameras, these are the three main aspects, but every camera is a little bit different.
Yeah.
So every camera's, even ISO is a little bit different. Different cameras have different native ISOs.
Yeah.
And you should, again, just learn your camera so you know what you're working with, so you can not only hit the floor where it is, but hit the ceiling.
Yeah.
Right? That's something that we want to talk about is every camera has a floor, every camera has a ceiling.
Yeah.
If you're well adjusted and you know how to use cameras in general and you know the rules and you know how to break them and everything,
you should be able to pick up any camera.
You should be able to pick up any camera, and not only just obviously like the floor is the floor. That's the worst that you can do with a camera.
And it's not hard to do.
If you're well versed, you're able to come close, if not hit the ceiling.
Yeah.
With just about any camera, whether it's phone, civilian, or like a Red or whatever.
Yeah. You should understand at least the basics and be like, I can set this up. I can make it look good. Or at least, I'd say 70%, 75%. Yeah. And then the training comes with using it over
practicing,
time.
Training with it. Exactly.
I mean, even me with my new Canon, it took me a little time.
Yeah.
But I went on a trip. I shot with it for 7 days straight. Yeah. And I wouldn't say I've mastered it yet, but I jumped from Sony to Canon. And
I mean, again, every camera is different. The Sony, the color space even is much different than the Canon.
I think talking color space, white balance.
White balance. So white balance is how warm or how cool.
Or how tinted it is as well. You can have your magentas
tinted,
and greens.
Yeah. Green, magenta are opposites.
Yep.
So something will either be magenta, balanced, or green. When it comes to teal and orange,
your temperature,
it'll either be blue, balanced, or warm.
Yep.
Right? So when you color correct, you want everything to be balanced. But with every camera, the color space of how it's programmed is slightly different. For example, we have a Sony that we shoot that no matter what we do,
it's green.
It's green. So we have to slam the magenta a little bit to color balance
Bring it back.
Right? Other cameras will shoot magenta, others will shoot blue, others will shoot warm.
My Canon is warm.
Exactly.
It's always
warm. It's really just about knowing the color space and also just practicing color corrections and color grading is so you can train your eye to see the different colors and everything.
And there is a scale.
Yeah.
So you have your scale of 3,300 to 9,000, right? And your 3,300 is candlelight, is what they say. It's really orange, really, really orange. And then you have your 9,000, or what they say, 6,500.
That's blue.
Sky. It's just the sky. So that's kind of base it off of that, is find what you're shooting in. Like if you walk into a room and you got really orange lights, they got those little Tesla bulbs up there, and they're like, look how cool our venue looks, or whatever it is. And it's like, oh my gosh, it's so orange.
So warm and inviting.
Yeah, not from my camera. So you need to take your white balance and see, wow, it's really hot and warm in here. Let's bring it down. So you'd bring that down to a 3,300.
And a way you can do that is point your camera at something that is supposed to be white.
Yeah.
And try to make it as white as possible.
And little tip for you, if you have a Sony, your little gray lens cap that comes with all your lenses or all your bodies, if you hold that in front of your lens and say white balance, it will perfectly white balance your camera every time. That gray, for whatever reason, not whatever reason, they built it that way.
They did it that way.
It will perfectly white balance your camera. So if that's a quick and easy way you want to learn about that, do it that way. But if not, learn the scale.
Learn the scale, and obviously once you know what you're doing, if you want to make a picture or photo or video warm, you know what to do. If you want to make it cool, you know what to do.
Yeah.
Same with green and magenta and any other colors. You know how to white balance the white.
They're opposites.
Right.
They're just opposites.
Yeah. So teal, orange, green, magenta.
Yeah. if it's too much of one of the other, add the other. If it's too blue, add orange. If it's too green, add magenta.
And actually, I would say maybe subtract
yeah,
first.
I guess subtract green.
Subtract before adding, because from personal
Adding
experience,
only comes from post-production, though.
yeah. Sometimes when you add too much, it can get a little convoluted.
Get a little hectic, yeah.
Start with subtracting.
Yeah.
I would
Get
say.
rid of...
At least in post-production.
Yeah.
Start with subtracting a little bit. If it doesn't, then add.
Bring it, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
But when you're shooting, it's the same.
Mm-hmm.
Add, subtract your blues or add your oranges, vice versa.
Vice versa.
Kind
to
of
whatever
switch
you're
it around.
counteracting. Yeah.
Yeah. They're just opposites. And I think it gets really lost when people are like, oh my gosh, how do I set up my white balance? I mean, it's as easy as someone wearing a white shirt into what you're doing. And
or maybe, again, kind of like what I said, it was pointed at something that's supposed to be white and balance it. Maybe bring something with you that is true white that you can point in front of your camera whenever you're at a shoot and balance that way.
Yeah. Just get your whites as white as possible.
And the more you do in actual production and pre-production, the less you have to do in post-production, where it becomes a lot more difficult to fix something.
Sometimes it's just lost.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just lost, and it's like, this is too warm at this point. Like, I can't fix it.
If you can fix it in production,
yeah.
Fix it in production, because it'll be a lot less of a headache in post-production.
Don't be a post-production shooter. Don't. It's a lot of people do it, and they're really good at it, and that's just the way they do things. I have a buddy he's like, I'll just fix it in post. It's like, okay, but you're an in-house shooter, and you have all the time in the world. Like, that's all he does. He shoots for one company. He's 9 to 5, and that's all he does. If you're going to be a contractor, if you're going to be out where you need to, like, not necessarily turn and burn, obviously don't burn your clients, but, like, if you need to get these done quick, make sure your production is set up as good as possible. And, like, a thing you can do in post-production is add more blur.
Yeah.
You can, but just do it there.
Yeah.
Just understand these 3-4 things now and make sure that they're set up to what you want it to look like. Because the less you have to do in post means the less time you actually have to work.
Yeah. I mean, generally in post, you can do anything. Right. You can do just about anything and everything.
It's how much time do you want to spend?
But that's the thing, is you're trading time for
an easy fix.
If
your shoot's 3 hours and you decide that you want to add more blur at the end of it.
I mean, in post-production, you're adding 30 minutes to an hour.
Every minute of footage.
When you could do it in production and maybe do it in 5 minutes.
Yeah. Or however long it takes you to set up your camera.
Exactly.
Like,
so, I mean, let's say it's really just adjusting a light, right? Yeah. That'll take...
Or your white balance to match the lights.
Exactly.
Like, just
you should be matching your white balance to your lights already. But if it's as simple as that, is just adjusting your camera or adjusting your lights, that takes less than a minute, maybe a minute.
Maybe.
Versus 30 minutes to an hour in post-production. So it's really about where your time management goes, and again, it's personal. If you prefer to do it in post-production, you can.
Sure.
But it's
if you have the time.
But exactly. But it's going to be a lot easier just to do it in production and save yourself the headache and the time in post-production.
I think, just make it easier on yourself.
Yeah, I mean, work smarter, not harder.
Yeah,
we've all heard that since
I would say like
forever.
80% of the cameras, civilian grade to super professional grade, allow you to do that. They allow you to make those changes. And I mean, if you're buying your camera from Costco, whatever, you need to start somewhere, right? You're going to have a little less versatility, which is fine, but understand those changes, because you're obviously going to have less understanding of post at that point. So just do what you can up front, I think, is the best advice. Like,
and then kind of with that is buying your camera in Costco. In a previous episode, we talked about deciding what you're going to buy.
Yeah.
So, obviously put some thought into that, and then put some thought into your ISO, shutter speed, and aperture once you've already bought it, and start practicing with the camera that you do have.
And I think that leads into your dynamic range. And I think dynamic range and your sensor size are pretty similar.
Yeah.
In the sense of what they're capturing. But when you're buying that camera, make sure it's big enough. Make sure it can capture what you're trying to do. You know, like if you're just getting started and you're a hobbyist and want to hop into this world, you know, you don't need to necessarily focus on this. You know, if you got 1080 or 4K, I think you're going to be fine. But if you're hopping into something and you've said, hey, I'm going to give you 4K at a low light setting with really hot lights above the person, you should probably look into your dynamic range and your sensor size. And there's 4 major types, I would say. You have your full frame, your APS-C, your Micro Four Thirds, and then your phone. And your phone is smaller than a Micro Four Thirds, but because of what it can do, it can be pretty dang good. Mm-hmm. But look into that. Look into what your dynamic range does and
how it affects what you're shooting.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's more sensor size.
It has to do with the amount of stops, which is a lighting thing, of course, and that's like the highlights versus the shadows. So the more, I would say the larger your sensor size, the more stops you're going to have, which affects your dynamic range, which means if you have 10 stops, your shadows and highlights are going to be a little harder to recover.
Right.
But if you're shooting on,
I mean, it's basically like, let's say this is 10 stops, right? This is 14 stops at your Black Magic.
Yeah.
And then you have your 16 stops at your reds and above.
Aries and all the majors.
So obviously it's a range. The more stops you have, the better quality of the highlights and the shadows that you're able to capture.
And it's more control in post. Mm-hmm. Which comes with experience as well. So choose your camera based on what you're doing. You know, if you're just taking portraits and, you know, you're doing family photos or you're shooting weddings, like you don't necessarily need to focus on that. But if you're shooting creative projects or you're a run and gun shooter, I highly recommend looking into your dynamic range and your sensor size. There's a lot of Fujifilm people that are out there, and there are medium format Fujifilms that do have full frame sensors, but most Fujifilms are Micro Four Thirds. Yeah. And it's fine. They can do a great job, but you need to be aware of that.
Yeah.
You need to be aware that that is going to affect your image, and you need to focus more on the native things for that camera. Which for me, it's like I would rather just go Sony or Canon
and just be as versatile
and
as
just
possible
get a Super 35 and just be versatile. And then you also don't have to do any math on your lenses to understand what am I shooting on.
Yeah, because even earlier when you were, because I'm a little naive to when it comes to sensor size. I'm still kind of learning that side of it, and the math where you were talking about, you know, if you have a 2.2.
Yeah, so like a Fujifilm is a 2.2 crop sensor.
Right.
Because it's a Micro Four Thirds.
A 14 lens, it's really a 28
or almost 30,
right?
Yeah. It's a 30.
Exactly. So you have to know
which changes your width on your angle.
So it's really just know what you're doing. If you're going to be doing something,
do you
want to
deal with that is really the thing.
There's math that comes along with it.
Yeah. And most of us creatives hate math. It's true. But
I hated math.
That's why I went with the Sony. I was like, I want a full frame. I want to know I'm putting a 50 millimeter on there, and it's going to be a 50 millimeter.
50.
Yeah. Or a 24 to 70.
Yeah.
It's not a 48 to 140, which is wild.
Which is great, honestly, in some ways.
Yeah.
But yeah.
Also depends on what you're shooting. So just understand those. Like, there's so many nuances and little tools that come with a camera, and every single brand does them a little differently. Mm-hmm. I mean, not the basics, your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. It's like those are the rules.
Yeah, but I mean, sensor size, color space, all like the small things. Everyone's going to be slightly different, but those slight differences do come across quite evidently. So
especially if this is your everyday.
Exactly. So you really should know what you're working with and how to adjust everything.
Yeah. Combine them.
Yeah.
Combine everything. Like, I think that if you're going into a shoot and you're not touching one of the 4 things, your white balance, your aperture, ISO, or shutter speed, you should.
I mean, you should be touching 2 to 3.
Every time.
Because, I mean, your white balance, regardless of what you're shooting, is going to be one of the main things.
Yeah.
Always. And that's like, at least for me, white balance first.
Yeah.
Right?
Set the color.
Set the color. Make sure that your whites are white, your darks are dark.
If you're not bringing any artificial light or any lights that you're setting up, just look at where you're sitting. If it's really orange, bring it down. If it's really blue or you're out in the sun, bring it up.
Yeah.
The sun is typically, 58 to 6,500. If you're inside and you're shooting at a venue, it's going to be anywhere from 3,000 to probably 4,500 every time.
Mm-hmm.
So just know that. Just know like what you're doing, how to set those things up. All three directly correlate each other, and sometimes it's really noticeable with shooters. It's like, ooh,
Yeah.
like you got your white balance right, but like, why is only the first 2 inches of his face in focus? It's like,
I can see his nose, but
yeah, where's the rest of his face? So
just know your camera, know what you're buying before you're buying, and then after, practice.
I do have a quick tip. If this is a ton of information and you're like, holy crap, where do I start? I always recommend, like, if you buy a camera, put it on auto and put it in different locations and see what the camera sets up. See, like, okay, I'm indoors with overhead lights and it's saying I'm at a 5500 and I should be at a 3.2 at a 1/50 shutter speed.
And then with
And
that
then
too
adjust.
is also like take note of whether there's a lot of windows that are allowing natural light in, or if it's like a closed room with just the light
The
that's
overhead,
in there, right?
yeah.
And pay attention to the kind of light. Is it a white light? Is it a warmer light?
Is it
a
tungsten?
cooler? Yeah, exactly.
Does it flicker with your shutter?
Take it a step further and really start noting those things down of what light bulbs are being used. Is there a lot of windows? Is like, what is the environment? So you can start really, really getting to the
Fine-tuning
nitty gritty.
those. The nitty gritty.
The nitty gritty.
But also, like, speaking on the window with the lights, if you have orange overlights and then a natural light behind there, that's going to make it really hard for you to edit and post because you have two
A mixture of
sets
orange
of
and
the
blue.
spectrums
Yeah.
fighting each other at that point. So it's also something to be very aware of. It can be really challenging.
And
We've run into it so many times.
Again, it's really just practice and experience. That's going to be
Yeah.
your best friend. But know what you're doing before you get to a client
Yeah.
and, potentially end up, like you said, turn and burn.
Yeah.
If this is the industry that you're going to want to be in, make sure that you're giving the best possible quality to
You want
your
it to be a
client.
relationship.
You want the best of what you're offering out there, and not
You're not a server. It's not a, burn and turn location. I'm
Yeah.
just looking for the tip. Like, if this is your full-time thing, you need to,
You want to build relationships and start building those bridges.
build them all. Get as many as you freaking can.
So I think that's
I think that's
Any
pretty much
other-
good. I think that's, I was going to say something about shutter speed, but I kind of forgot. Yeah.
But yeah, if you have
Just-
any questions, reach out to us. You can always reach us at apertureoceanproductions.com.
Or weirdly artistic.
weirdlyartistic.com. You can find our episodes on Spotify, Apple, and
Any of the above. Just search us up. We're there.
exactly.
We're always here.
Always staying weird.
Stay weird.